Hey guys, welcome to the second volume of Developing Realistic Shaders in Unreal 4 Cinema 4D, and we're going to start this course with some wood shaders. The most important part of your wood shader would be your diffuse color. So finding a perfect texture or creating a perfect texture is your most important job when you're trying to create a believable and realistic wood shader. As you can see from this example, generally speaking, the diffuse contribution is so overpowering that you really are going to have a hard time creating a realistic wood shader without having a beautiful texture, right? So you can see, so the most important part is the diffuse color texture. The reflection is really is going to vary based on the type of wood and based on the reference you are trying. You can see we have some very matte examples, some very reflective examples. You can see in some examples we have, for example, here you can see so much contrast in the wood grain. You can see the darker grains are less reflective, they are rougher, and the you can see this brighter grains are basically sharper and more reflective. So you can see it really depends on the surface and the reference you are trying to recreate. And obviously you can see some examples here are very old and aged and antique, and some are like this one are very clean and new. We have some painted examples, so it's really depends on what you're trying to create. So let me just get back to this examples here. Okay, so you're going to start with printing something like this, not this upper section, just this part down here. We're not going to be making it exactly like this because there's so many details, and I just want to start with some basic examples. Here you can see, first of all, we have this beautiful wood texture. We have some level of contrast in the specular weight and the specular roughness. Also, you can see it's just not the wood grain that controls the specular weight and the specular roughness. We have another layer and another layer and other details that basically adds so many things to the shader itself, right? So we need to add some irregularity, on top of the wood grain itself for controlling our specular weight and our specular roughness. You can see we have some nice antique effect in the edges and in the darker and deeper parts. You can see this patina here. So we need to also add those two. We're just basically creating some examples of different types of wood shaders. And we're going to be using this photo here as our general guideline. You can see the bump is quite more visible in this upper section, mainly because we have this kind of reflection of light here, so it helps us to see the bump effects much easier compared to this part that they don't have any direct light source hitting them. So that's why we see the bump mapping more obviously on top here. But at the same time, because this upper section, we basically dent them by putting stuff on here, and you can see these dentations and bumpiness happening because of those actions. So they're going to be more bumpier compared to here. It doesn't really matter that much in this example. I'm just going to show you how to kind of see the shader. Right, so let's get creating. I think we're ready. I'm gonna just put this thing aside, and this is the scene that we are having here. Let's start by creating a new standard shader, and that's going to be our simple example. Great. Let's apply to our TV stand here and open it up. Let me just try to... Perfect. So this is our standard shader, and I'm going to, first of all, as I mentioned, control my diffuse color with a nice texture, And in this example, you can see I have some shaders prepared, right? So I'm going to be using this one. You can see I just have one texture and just paint it and color correct them in Photoshop, and now I have 5 versions of the same texture. And you can use whatever you want, but I think this one is more close to what we have here. So let me use this, and let me just hold down Alt, insert before as the diffuse color. Right, select the standard shader itself, and maybe we can use this as our general guideline. So increase the diffuse weights. Let's go to the specular. This reflection for me, it's something like 0.2, 0.3, maybe something like that. It's not like metals, they are not that reflective as metals. Obviously we need to change this to GGX. Let's turn on our Fresnel for the time being. For the roughness, even though I think it's something like 0.15 or 0.2 would be enough, right? For the Fresnel, let's turn on Fresnel use IOR. And for stuff like wood, concrete, ceramic, or stuff like that, you can go between 3 to 5, 6. I'm gonna start with something like maybe 3 and see where we are gonna go from here. So that's our very basic, example. I'm going to be just running the IPR and see what I'm gonna get, and I'll be back to start talking about specular weight and specular roughness. So here is our IPR, and as you can see, because the texture is so beautiful and gorgeous, we really feel that wood being represented here, right? Right now you can see the reflections are very even. Maybe they are a bit too sharp compared to the example that we have, but we're going to start to control the specular weight and specular roughness with some map. As I mentioned, the texture that we used here as our diffuse is going to be the most important. We're going to be using it to control the specular weight, the specular roughness, the bump. So we're going to have that basically procedural way of doing things that right now, after we finish the whole texture, the whole shader, sorry, just by replacing this wood image here, this wood texture here, we'll be having a completely different result. And I'm going to show you that too. So let's start by, I don't know, maybe we can actually think, I see some repetitions here, but I think it's going to be okay. Maybe we need to decrease the scale U and V so we don't get that sort of repetitions here, but I think that's just fine. The grain size here feels natural to me. So let's start with the specular roughness here. So let's see, there we go. Maybe we just can open this here and make it a bit smaller. So for the specular weight, let me first of all have a color correct node, and I'm going to desaturate this image. So if I connect this directly, I'm just going to desaturate it. And then if we come here, I can now connect this directly to my specular weights. And if I connect the standard shader, you can see we start to see this sort of, take a look at this, if you can get it right. There we go. You can see we have so much contrast in this example right now. And if I just go ahead and actually render a part like this maybe and run the IPR here, we should start to get that contrast. So as you can see, for example, from this part that we have this nice highlights, you can see the contrast just way too much compared to the example that we have here. The wood grain doesn't affect the specular weight, that much that we have right now. So to control that, what I'm gonna do is to mix this map with another color. So if you remember, we had the specular weight, I think it was about 0.3. So if I use a mix node here, let's see, obviously we can use a RAM float node to control this map here, right? So we can simply come here, use a RAM float node, decrease the contrast. But another way of doing maybe the same thing is going to be using a mix node, right? So this color correction is going to be our first input. And for the second input, I'm going to be using a value very close to what we had. We used a specular weight of about 0.3. So I'm going to use something like maybe 25%. So something like 0.25 in our specular weight. So if I press OK right now, and the mix value is 0.5, and if I connect this, you can see we get now a mixture between our color corrected image and this value at 0.5. So we can increase this mix value to something like 0.75 to favor our second input, or we can decrease it to favor our first input. But right now we get 50% of the image and 50% of this color, and this is the result that we are getting. So let me just go ahead and connect this whole thing. Let's just, if you compare it, you can see the difference. Just you can see it gets much more realistic. Let me just go ahead and actually see the whole thing in the IPR, and I'll be back when it's finished. So here is our IPR, and if I come here and actually compare it to my previous render, you can see this is our first render and this is our second render, and as you can see, it's much more realistic compared to what we had before, right? Now that we have added that contrast in the specular weight, right? Much better. I'm seeing too much repetition in these parts of my texture, so I'm actually going to select this image here, and if I just come here and connect this and press play or run the IPR, just going to use something like 0.5 and 0.5, and I think that's better, much better. Okay, now let's just add a bit more variation to our specular weight, so it just wouldn't be controlled by the wood grain and the wood texture that we have. Let me use another image, and I'm going to be using this one with 38. Obviously, I need a layer color node to combine the... Okay, I'm actually seeing one mistake here. We forgot to connect the mix node here to the specular weight instead of this, and that would have been quite different. So for the time being, if I just connect the specular, the mix node to the specular weight here, you should be able to see. I was noticing it's a bit too contrasty, but that's okay, it happens. So now that we have, you can see some of these buckets up here. Great. Now let's just start combining this. So this is going to be our first layer, and this image node, if I just come here and use it, at the same time I need to go here and decrease. Let's go to something like 0.25. I see so much repetition happening here, and I don't want those very dark spots really to affect my specular weight. And so what I'm gonna do is to use a ramp float or ramp RGB even can work, but so insert after as the input, and I'm just going to select this first point and really increase it to something like this. So it wouldn't be that effective, and this is going to be our second layer. So layer 2 right now, this is what's basically controlling our specular weight. But now that we have our second layer, I can increase its layer 2 alpha and maybe go to something like multiply, and you can see we add that irregularity. You can see these darker spots here and there, which is what I want. Let me just increase this thing a tad. So this layer now is going to be controlling our specular weight. And let me just manage how these layers are happening. This is our second layer, possibly, let's see, something like this. So that's good. Let's connect our standard shader directly. And as our previous IPR wasn't that accurate because we forgot to actually connect the mix node to the specular weight directly, I'm gonna wait for this IPR to see where we are. So here is our IPR, and we can see a bit more detail. Now, what I want to do is to start working on my specular roughness. So let's get started. And for the specular roughness, again, I'm going to be using another layer color node. And first of all, this is the color correction node that comes from our base image layer or base image node. So let me just have a ramp float node in between and connect the as the input. Obviously, as I mentioned in the previous lessons and in the first volume, that because now we're using the same basically image to control both our specular weight and our specular roughness, we are going to have to actually invert the image, because at the first, in the specular weight, the darker parts of the shader, we just connect this thing here and run the IPR. The darker part of the shader of the image in the specular weight are going to be, having less specular weight, and the darker parts, when you connect it to the specular roughness, they are going to be sharper compared to the whiter part of texture. So we need to invert this guy. So right now we are basically replacing the dark parts and the white parts, right? It's really hard to see. Hopefully you see it in the recording. But now we are having that balance. So in the specular weight, where the parts are going to be having less specular weight, they are also going to be a bit more rougher in the specular roughness, right? So I'm just going to actually reset this, invert it, and just I'm really having a hard time seeing this, so I'm just going to really, let's see, add that contrast so you can see. Also, I don't want it to be so rough. The roughness I think we used was something like 0.15, so I'm just going to decrease this value so it wouldn't be so rough. It's not like 0.15, something like this would be enough. So we have this image to control our specular roughness, right? Great. And this is our first layer. For the second layer, I'm going to be using the this image, which is our BW38. if our IPR, there we go. But obviously we need to do the same thing with this image and also invert it. So that's our RAM float. So this is this one, input. First of all, I'm going to invert it. And let me just maybe something like 0.25, just a tad. I don't want a very dark spot, so it would be very sharp there. And right now we have avoided that problem. There we go. Now this is going to be our second layer to the map that controls the specular roughness basically. And if I connect this directly, increase the layer 1 alpha, and layer 2, let's go to something like 0.25 maybe. So now we have this combination that controls our specular roughness, right? Right now our specular roughness is about 0.15, and let's just connect this. As I mentioned, the diffuse color is so overpowering that seeing specular roughness or specular weight, even specular weight, it's a bit more visible, but the specular roughness is going to be a bit hard to actually see it in the shader. But let's connect that and also see what we are going to get in the IPR. So you can see from the IPR some changes, but we can compare it to our previous result when the IPR is finished. So that's our render, and you know, that's good, but I really think the wood grains on these parts are just too big. So what I'm going to do is to actually come here and change my scale UNV to 1, and I'm going to stop the recording right now and go ahead and adjust the UVs for some of the parts of this model, and I'm just going to adjust this part. You can see just so much repetition happening here. I'm going to adjust those, and I'll be back when it's done. So that's what we have. Just went ahead and adjust the UVs a bit, and I think the grain size in these two crucial sections are just a lot better, and I just adjust the UVs in other parts to make them a bit more harmonious. Now, as you can see, I have my actually texture visible in viewport. If you don't know, you can simply connect whatever texture that you have to your Arnold viewport port here, and it will be visible in your viewport. And while I was adjusting the UVs, you know, it's very useful to actually see the texture in the viewport. Great. Now, the next thing I want to kind of work on is the bump map for this basic example, right? Let me just actually go ahead and run the IPR here. I have these two other cameras. If we get the IPR running, okay, let's see. This is a better example for the bump. Let's see. I'm just going to start with a bump map or bump node. So this is our shader, and for the bump map itself, I'm going to be using a combination of these two image nodes. The first image node that we had, and then the second one, which is going to be the image BW38, right? So let me just have a RAM float node for both of these guys. So this is the first one, and we just zoom in here, control drag. So let's connect this first one here and connect the second image. Sorry, we want to be connected from the color correction node because we want the black and white version of this wood texture, right? And for this image, which is black and white itself, so we have this two RAM float node. So this is the first one, and this is the second one. Now So this is our IPR here working. So a layer color node for the time being, and okay. So let's just start without adjusting anything and connect this first map to our, and also let me just work on these parts. Okay. So I connect the first texture, which is this one, our wood texture, to my first layer, and so let me just actually connect this for the time being just directly to the bump map here. And if I connect this, we should start to get some bump mapping happening. So you can see the effect of bump mapping. I mean, I can increase this so you can really see the effect. It was maybe something like 10 centimeter, and you start to get that effect. Obviously, this is just way too much, but let's see some buckets here. So that's what we have right now. I think that's a bit too much. Let's go to something like maybe 1 centimeter for the time being. I think even 1 centimeter is, as you can see, if we're trying to create this surface, and especially if you're focusing on these parts, you can see the bump mapping isn't really that effective. I mean, in these parts is very effective, but our focus right now is on the main part, which is this one. And this is a very specific bump mapping that's happening here, but in this case, you can see in these parts, the bump mapping isn't that effective. That's what we have, and I think it's way too much, honestly. So I'm going to even decrease this value to a very slight number, something like 0.1 will possibly be enough, and doesn't have to be, you know, quite visible. We don't want to say, hey, this is bump mapping happening here, right? We just want subtle effects that, especially if we have a direct light source here, the bump mapping would be much more visible even at 0.1 centimeter, right? So I'm gonna say 0.1 is enough. In this case, I'm actually going to maybe even adjust the ramp float node here a tad, so it wouldn't be that contrasty. So let me just I think actually it would help if I can see the texture. Something like this. I really don't want to see that much contrast because I can't see any contrasty bump mapping here, right? So that would be enough. And for the second layer, this is just going to be our first layer, and let's just add a bit more. That's our first layer, and that's going to be our bump map. And for the second layer, if I connect this thing directly, obviously there's too much contrast here, and let me just decrease the overall amount of contrast to something maybe like this, and that's going to be our second layer. That's coming from our BW38 image, so that's going to be connected to layer 2. And for this one, if I just see my layer here, so you can see something like 0.3. So we have a combination of those two, ever so slightly, but I think in this case that would be enough. Right? It really needs to be subtle. Okay, it might not be visible at all, but I think those subtle effects accumulating finally are going to give us a final nice beautiful shader. So that's our basic wood example. I'm just going to get back to this camera and actually So that's basically our basic wood example. It's a fairly basic shader network. Now we're gonna add a tad more detail, like, you know, adding that antique feeling and just going through making it a bit more believable and realistic. So I will see you after the IPR is finished. So as you can see, the IPR is finished and this is what we are gonna get. And if I were to go ahead and show you in the picture here, you can see we start with this and we just started adding more detail, adjusting stuff, and this is the result that we are getting. This is our basic wood shader, right? Now I want to add that antique feeling to the profiles, to these deeper parts. So let's do that. It's gonna be, I'm gonna actually change my material to the material list so we can also close this. Great. So I'm going to duplicate this, and this is going to be, I don't know, wood. Let's see. It's going to be antique and let's say subtle this time. And let's apply this shader here and open it up. So to add that antique feeling, I'm going to be using an ambient occlusion shader. So this is our ambient occlusion, and let's see what we're going to get by default. So if I press Ctrl Shift V and run the IPR, or Alt W and V, this is what we're going to get by default. So the first thing, I'm going to increase the samples so it wouldn't be too noisy. Obviously now I want to have that darker color to appear in these corners, right? And we're going to be using this ambient occlusion as a layer 2 alpha. So what's going to happen if I show you? So this is the image that controls our basically diffuse color, right? So I'm going to be connecting this as my first layer. For the second layer, we're going to be using a very dark brownish color. If I just maybe pick a color from here, something like this, right? And now we're going to be using this ambient occlusion node to control the layer 2 alpha. So this darker color will only appear in these deeper parts and in the nooks and crannies and in the profiles, right? So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is to obviously the white parts are going to be replaced with the black to white. And if I just increase the fall off here, you can see now we have a beautiful black and white map that we can use it to basically make this second layer appear. So what I'm gonna do is to use this. If I just make some space here, so that's our image node, that's the layer color, that's the ambient occlusion, and that's going to be controlling our layer 2 alpha. And this is going to here, so diffuse color. And now if I come here and render, this part, we should be able to see some of that antique feeling already. So if you just render this section and wait for the IPR, you can start these darker edges and this darker, you can see these deeper parts are quite darker right now, and that's coming from our ambient occlusion. So right now, if I just show you the diffuse map, which is this layer color, is a combination of our main image and the ambient occlusion node, this is what we're going to get, right? So let's connect that. So you can see this is our diffuse map. So if we only use our image, this is what we're going to get. You can see no darker sections. But if I maybe just come down here, but if I connect the layer color node where we added our ambient occlusion, you start to see these darker corners, right? So only the image. Take a look, sorry. Take a look at these parts, at these corners, and now with the ambient occlusion, God. So let's see, Control-Shift-V, there we go. So that's this very subtle antique. I'm just going to connect the standard shader, connect the bump node, sorry, and wait for the IPR, and I'll be back when it's finished. So this is the render, and if I come here and actually compare it to the previous render that we have, I don't know, the shortcut sometimes just doesn't work. And now you can see this is the previous render without adding that antique feeling, and this is the current render. Let me just take a look at this. So you can see, take a look at these parts, take a look at this edges. So you can see, obviously, we get that antique feeling. Now, if I wanted to make this antique feeling and this basically darker edges a bit more powerful, I can simply color correct my ambient occlusion node. So let me show you how I'm going to do that. I'm just going to duplicate that, and let's antique, you know, I don't know, maybe intense, and let's apply this. And if I open it up, and also let me just go ahead and maybe see the ambient occlusion maybe in this part. Okay, so if I take a look at the ambient occlusion that we have right now, this is the result that we're getting, right? I can simply use a RAM float node. So this is the RAM float node, and this is the input. Connect this, reset that, and I'm just going to basically increase the contrast of this map. So if I just can see from the map, we're basically increasing the contrast and making the white parts to be more visible. So maybe something like this, right? So this is just our ambient occlusion, and this is after, you know, color correcting it. And now if I use this as my layer 2 alpha, right now this is the map that we are having, right? But if I use the color corrected version of my ambient occlusion, you can see it gets way more powerful. And now that's good. Now I can connect my bump map again directly, and even from the IPR you can see that this effect now is way too powerful, right? Maybe a bit too much actually. So let me just go to this ambient occlusion node and maybe just decrease the contrast, so you can see, yeah, that's a bit better, I guess. You can see, compare this to here, you can see now it's actually way better. Not better, just more intense effect. It really depends on what you're trying to recreate. Let's see some of these buckets here. Okay, so that's what we're having compared to our previous render. Perfect. Let me just wait for the whole thing, and then we can compare it to our previous render. So this is what we are having, and as you can see, the antique effect is much intense compared to our previous render. And also, if I wanted to show you in the picture viewer, you can see we have this is our previous render, and this is the one after we color corrected the ambient occlusion and added more contrast, right? So first one, second one, you can see the effect is more obvious. right? Take a look at these parts or this section here. Great, or down here. Great. Now, if you take a look at this example that we had here, you can see this patina effect, this antique effect, isn't you know, that straightforward and that perfect in every place. If I zoom in, you can see we have different amount of that effect in different places. I mean, in this example, even that is very subtle. You can see we have this sort of wave. It's different amount in different spots, right? So if you take a look here, it's not quite perfect and the perfect line. Now, if you wanted to kind of break up this antique effect and make it a bit more realistic, so let me just actually duplicate this and, I don't know, intense, let's name it broken up. And if I just use this one, let me maybe again do something like this. And if I open it up, so that's our ambient occlusion. And now we need to break the ambient occlusion effect, right? So for that matter, let's load an image node. And in this case, I'm just going to maybe, sorry for that. I think this can be a good example. Okay, let's use this. And if I just connect this directly and run the IPR, I just render this part so we can do it a bit quicker. Let's decrease the scale, maybe to something like 0.2. That's better. And also, let's invert the image, insert after input. Going to reset the whole thing. Let's see. I'm just going to add a bit more contrast. Maybe something like this. Be helpful. And we can simply multiply them, but I'm going to be using a layer color node. So this is our ambient occlusion. This is the ramp float that adding more contrast to our ambient occlusion. So this is going to be our first layer. And this, which is this map here, is going to be our second layer. If I connect that, change these to multiply, and let's increase this. You can see now it's basically breaking that pattern. So let me go to something like 0.45, 0.5. So I just want to add some subtle changes here and there. So that's what we're going to get. You can see now it's not as perfect as it was before. Let me just stop the IPR. So if I just come down here and now connect this to my layer 2 alpha, and this is our bump. See, let's connect this directly and run the IPR again and see what we're gonna get. There we go. As you can see, it's not quite perfect, but I think the effect is kind of weak compared to what I want. So let's see what we can do here. One thing I can possibly do is to add a bit more contrast to the original ambient occlusion map. So if I just get back here, which is this one, I can simply add a bit more contrast to the original ambient occlusion map, and now as you can see, now we get a bit more of that effect. And as you can see, it's not that perfect. We see some slight pattern that's break up the effect slightly. I really don't want that breakup to be so obvious. That's why I actually decrease the layer to alpha to something like 0.4 so it wouldn't be so obvious. I think that's beautiful. It's gonna get us a beautiful render. You can see the effect in some of these parts. Not so perfect. Okay, so let me just close this and we'll see what we're gonna get in the IPR. So that's the result that we're having. And if I come here and actually quickly compare it to this example, you can see this is our previous example and this is this render. You can see some of these parts, you can see it's not as perfect, and we get this broken up effect basically, which makes it a bit more realistic in my opinion compared to what we had before. Okay. The effect also gets a bit subtler compared to what we had before, but I think this is nice. In some parts also it gets stronger because of the map that we are having that breaks up the ambient occlusion. So if you take a look at this part, for example, you can see, right, it's not as perfect as it was before. Okay. Now, if I want to create a, the reflections are kind of very sharp at the timing. If I want to create a matte version of the same shader, I can simply duplicate this and let's name it matte. And what I just need to do is to make my specular roughness maps a bit brighter, right? So right now, if I come here, that's the shader that we have, and this is the part that controls the specular roughness basically, you can see. So this is the map that we're having right now. So if I just run the IPR and connect this and wait a few seconds. So what I'm going to do is just to make this image a bit brighter. So let's just maybe a lot brighter. And just also have some contrast in there. Something like this can work, right? And for this one, let's just make it brighter. So maybe something like this. So that's the second map that we have. Now, as you can see, it's quite brighter compared to what we had before, and the result will be, we're gonna get, if I just take a look at these sections right now, let me just Control-Shift-Z to undo the change in the view. So as you can see from here, we have a more matte version of our render. As you can see, the reflections aren't that sharp this time. So I'm just going to wait for this and see what we're going to get. So this is our render, and as you can see, if I also show you in the picture viewer, you can see this is the render and this is the previous one. So it's a lot more matte and rough compared to this render. If you take a look, for example, at these sections here, right? Okay. Now for the next example, I just want to add this effect. You can see these worn out edges in this example. It's quite obvious. We're just going to make these edges a bit more weary and worn out. And as you can see, in these edges, we have a different diffuse color. The specular weight seems to be less, so you can see they are a bit less reflective and maybe a bit more rough. And they're only appearing on the outer edges, right? So let's create that. I'm just going to duplicate this original shader here, and let's make them with, I don't know, maybe worn out edges. And let's apply this here. Right, let's open it up. And I'm gonna be adding another standard shader. So this is our bump map, right? I just come here and make more space. This is our bump map. This is our first standard shader, right? Now let's create another standard shader. Okay, and let me just use another image. Get a bit closer here. So for the image, I'm going to be using this one. And let's just see it. Doesn't really matter that much because we are only going to see it on the outer edges. So that's what we are having by default. And I think the color difference is a bit too much, you know, between this and our original shader. So I'm going to just make that color difference to be less obvious. So a layer color, and this is our first layer. Let me just make these windows smaller. So this is our first layer. For the second layer, I'm going to be using a very similar color to what we have here. So I mean, maybe we can go to something like this, press OK and increase visibility and connect that. You can see now it's getting a bit more closer to what we had before. Okay, so that's going to be our diffuse color. Let's connect the standard shader and increase the diffuse weight. Let's add some small amount of specular weight, turn on GGX and Fresnel. Fresnel use IR and increase the IR something like 3, or even you can go to smaller values here. And let's just increase this maybe something like 0.55. So this is the shader that's gonna be visible on the edges, right? Now to control these, we're gonna be using another ambient occlusion. So basically to control the alpha map for this. So let me just connect this directly. Let's see. If I increase the samples, let's invert the normals. Let's see. If I change these colors for the time being, and now invert the normals, reduce my far clip to even smaller volume, something like this, and the spread, let's see, 0.8, 0.75 maybe. If I change my near clip to 0, I've discussed the ambient occlusion node in the comprehensive introduction to Arnold Four Cinema 4D. If you don't understand the ambient occlusion and its parameters, you can simply go ahead and actually watch that course there, or just go ahead and read the help file and help page in the Arnold website. Okay, that's good. So I'm just going to, as I mentioned, you can see in these parts, this effect, this worn out effect isn't quite straightforward. You can see we have this, get these breakups here and there, right? So you can see, so for that, let's do what we did before. So it should be quite simple by now. So let me just use maybe something like this here, and let me just make it a bit more contrasty, and this time let me just use a simple color correction node. Few people actually told me, why are you using RAM floats node that much to control the contrast? Why not using a simple color correction node? I really feel a bit more comfortable using RAM floats node, so it's really up to you. So I'm just going to, this time, instead of a layer color node, simply use a multiply node, and I'm going to be multiplying my ambient occlusion node with the second input, and the result should give us this breakup effect, right? So now if I just come here, use a layer color node to combine these two maps. So layer color node, this is our original standard shader, so that's going to be our first layer, and this is our second layer, and the map that we just created, the ambient occlusion map, is going to be our layer 2 alpha, right? And also let's connect this to our bump map shader inputs, if I can get it right. There you go. So that's the map that controls that. Great. And if I just come here and connect that to my bump, to the Arnold root, we should see some changes. Let me also save the scene here. And as you can see, we get this beautiful effect. So as you can see, the render is finished, and honestly, it's quite beautiful and authentic. Now, obviously, if you wanted to maybe increase this effect, you can just simply color correct the ambient occlusion and add a bit more contrast, or you know, just open this one, or simply this is the second standard shader, or simply, you know, add a bit more contrast to the image that breaks up that first pattern. So as you can see, it's fairly simple. We did it before, and if you want, you can do it again. Now, the beautiful thing about these shaders is we can very simply change the entire look by simply replacing one image. So if I just duplicate this and apply it here, sorry, actually, I don't want to duplicate the matte version. Let me just delete that. Let's duplicate this one and apply it here. So what I can do is to come onto the first image that we had, which is this one, and use another wood shader, wood texture. So in this case, for example, let's use this one. And if I just connect it here, we should see a different result. If I just run the IPR here, and so now, as you can see, we are getting an entirely different result by just replacing one single image, and everything is going to follow. Now, this is a very similar image to what we use, just the colors are a bit different, but if you use an entirely different wood texture with different grain patterns, you're going to get very consistent results, because This image here, as you can see, is basically connected to everything, right? So it's controlling the diffuse color, the specular weight, the specular roughness, the bump. So it's basically an Uber texture here, and by just replacing this, you're going to get an entirely different result. So as you can see, this is what we're going to get. So just going to stop the IPR, or in this case, the one with the worn out edges, I can again duplicate it and do the same thing. So if I just change the image here to the same image that we just used, this one, and let's this time connect this one, and again run the IPR. Now you can see, hopefully if the IPR is going to, okay. Now, as you can see, you're going to get a very different result. Now, in this case, we might need to actually go ahead and change the second standard shader to make it a bit more closer to the base shader that we have. But I think even this can be beautiful, right? So what I'm going to do is to, actually, let's do that quickly. I don't think it's going to be very hard. So the second standard shader is this one. And I'm just going to change the layer color node, let's say to something like this. Maybe this time press OK. The result should change a bit. Okay. So there you go, you have these different results. So it's very simple. Now basically we're done with this first lesson. I'm just going to go ahead and render all of these shader with higher quality settings. And when it's done, I'm gonna be back and just walk you through the renders. So as you can see, the renders are finished, and first of all, the render times that you can see here aren't valid at all because I have been editing the recorded videos and doing other things, so these numbers here can be a lot smaller for you. So this is our first render. As you can see, this is the basic simple example. In the second one, we added that subtle antique look. In the third one, as you can see, we added that more intense antique. And in the fourth render, we tried to break up that antique pattern a bit to make it a bit more complex and believable and realistic. In the second one, as you can see, we have the matte render. As you can see, the reflections are more matte. And in this one, we have the worn out edges, as you can see, very beautiful indeed. And in this one, we just changed the base image with another texture. And as you can see, you get a beautiful result, right? And in the last render, we just have the worn out edges for this new texture. I hope you learned and enjoyed a lot, and I will see you in the next lesson.